Let's now focus on the language itself. Latin is considered a dead language, but should we consider it a dead language? Currently, it is the official language of the Vatican, so there are people who still speak Latin. But more importantly, I would say that it did not die so much as it evolved into other languages. Let's talk about the evolution of Latin. Why did Latin evolve? All languages change, all languages evolve, and they do because speakers start speaking differently from their parents. It's a little bit like the telephone game. Someone says one word and then the other person here is a little bit different and the word starts evolving and changing through time. So in Latin there was a word that was homine. Homine meant man in Latin. Little by little that word changed into omne and then into hombre and then into hombre, which is the word that we say now in Spanish for man. But we could ask, why do people start talking differently from their parents? If children kept talking exactly like their parents, languages will never change. But this is not how it works. Let's see four different reasons. One is the reduction of effort. Then there's also language contact or bilingualism, imperfect acquisition, and an inherent variability of languages. What do I mean by reduction of effort? Languages change because some sounds are easier to pronounce than others, and some sound combinations are more comfortable and easier. So for example, interesting, it's easier to pronounce without pronouncing the vowel that we still have in written. And it's the same phenomenon that happened in Latin with the word homine, which changed into omne because people stopped pronouncing the vowel. It was easier not to pronounce it. Another reason why languages change is language contact and bilingualism. When two languages are in contact for a long time, they influence each other, and we see this a lot in the United States in words that we borrow from another language. Also sounds change by the influence from the sounds in another language, and also grammar. There's also another reason, imperfect acquisition. When kids acquire the language, they might not acquire it completely. They might make mistakes. Maybe you have heard that word, goat, as the past of go. And some children make that error, and it's very common. It makes sense. There is nothing wrong with that. And children, when their parents correct them, or after a while, they stop saying goat and say went. But what will happen if those kids never moved into went? If they kept saying goat? They will be adults and they will keep saying goat, and that will be the new word. Their children will learn the word goat from them. And you might think that this is impossible, that this could never happen, that when goat will never be the right word. But that's actually what happened in the past with the word thrive. We used to have the past throve. Right now, you might think it's very weird to say throve, but it's the same thing as with drive and drove. But children didn't say it right when they were young, and then they will say thrived. And what happened is that they kept saying thrived. They were never, and they didn't moved into throve. And that was the word that their children learned. And this is a word that we say nowadays. So changes happen because those new words that are introduced, sometimes by children, by young people who didn't learn the right word, just kept saying it. Another reason that we need to consider is the inherent variability of languages. That means a natural tendency of languages to change. And this is a little bit ironic because people resist to change whenever there's a new word or a new way to pronounce things or a word that is used with a different meaning, like literally. People resist, they don't like it, they say that young people are destroying the language. But this is very natural. This is a natural tendency of languages to change. And why is that? It's because many sounds are very close to one another, and it's very easy to move from one sound to another. For example, think of T and P. Pronounce those sounds. Can you think of two sounds that are very similar to those two? A sound that's very similar to T and a sound that is very similar to P? And this little bar means that we're talking about the sound, not the letter. Well, a sound that is very similar to T is D, and that's why the T sound in Latin evolved into D, and this little symbol means evolved into. So the word vita in Latin evolved into vida in Spanish, which means life, and we can see it in words as like vitamin, still with a T. The sound P is very similar to the sound B, and that's why the words that had P in Latin evolved into B, and that's why we have lupus evolving into lobo, which means wolf. And now you can make the connection with the technical word for wolf, which is canis lupus. Here you can see it nowadays in Spanish, lobo. Is Spanish the only language that evolved from Latin? No, there are many other languages. Those are called Romance languages. Those are Spanish, Catalan, Portuguese, Italian, Galician, Romanian, French, and Occitan. And you might think that there are some of those languages that you have never heard about, probably Occitan and Galician. And I don't intend for you to learn them, but here you have a map of where all these languages are spoken, and you can see that it roughly corresponds to the Roman Empire territory. Let's see an example with one specific word, the word pater. Pater in Latin meant father, and it has evolved into padre in Spanish, also in Italian, into para in Catalan, pai in Galician and Portuguese, and père in French. Those are different words, but you can see some similarity because they come from the same word. That's a little bit like different siblings that are different, but they have some similarities because they have the same parents. Now, what about English? English is not a Romance language. It's not a language that evolved from Latin, but we see many Latin words used in English today. Some of those are legal terminology. And also we see it in planets, in the name of some constellations, also in astrology, and we see it in words that are body parts or words related to body parts. For example, a bicep is a muscle with 2 heads in Latin, and a tricep is a muscle with 3 heads, 3 from 3. Pulmonary, it's related to lungs, like a pulmonary disease is a disease of the lungs. Why do we have the word pulmonary and not something that sounds like lung? Because pulmonary is the word that has evolved, that we have taken from Latin. Something similar with dentist. Dentist is a doctor that takes care of your teeth. We don't say teeth doctor or tooth doctor. We have dentist, which is related to the Latin word for tooth. And buccal. Buccal is something related to the mouth. So now it won't be surprising, I guess, to know that pulmón is the Spanish word for lung, and that diente is tooth in Spanish, and boca is the word for mouth in Spanish. So actually, you probably know more Spanish words than you think. And they are very similar to English because in English they might have been taken from Latin.